right, everyone, we're going to jump into legal issues, one of the best parts about being a nurse. Welcome to CASRN, where I teach you about all things nursing. In this video, we're going to cover ethics and then the legal issues surrounding nursing practice and patient rights. So first off, ethics. This is a broad principle for guiding nurse conduct. It's not legal or legally binding. However, the Board of Nursing in your state can reprimand you for violating these. It's a philosophy related to distinguishing between right and wrong. And there's a couple of parts inside that is the values. And that's the attitudes and beliefs that are affecting an individual's actions or decisions. And we have morals, which is an individual's belief and behavior of what is right. And then an ethical dilemma is when there's no obvious right choice. This is when a nurse needs to use ethical reasoning, which is the process of thinking through the problem, some self-introspection regarding the issue, and then talking the problem out with a supervisor, and then evaluating possible courses of action. The Nurse Practice Act is something that regulates nursing practice. Each state is going to regulate its own nursing practice, and so they each have their own requirements for what it is to become a nurse. That includes education requirements, and then some definitions of nursing versus medical practice, and then defining what skills can and cannot be done by each level of nursing. So, and then these are also the things that are going to set disciplinary actions for those that violate the requirements as set forth by each state. The standard of care is basically the clients being able to expect a certain level of care. These are the guidelines for appropriate nursing care. And then nursing practice is expected to be performed within these standards. So we have specific ways that we administer medication. We have specific ways that we treat specific diseases. And all of those things are laid out and called the standard of. So we want to make sure as nurses that we're aware of that we're following those guidelines, and that inside our nursing practice that we are performing to that level of care. If not, that's when you become liable. So next up, we've got liability, and this is being responsible for patient care. This means that you're held liable for harm that is caused by substandard care. So that's why knowing the standards of care is really important, because if you fail to do that, you are a nurse and you have passed the NCLEX and you've shown that you have develop some level of competency, and if you do not do that, then you can be held liable when harm is caused to your patient by substandard care. If that happens, one of the things that can happen is having professional discipline, and this is done by your individual state board of nursing. Some things that can lead to being disciplined is abandonment or abuse, breach of confidentiality, or conduct that puts the patients or the public at risk, inaccurate documentation, inappropriate delegation, and unprofessional conduct. Something that's also really important to understand is the patient's Bill of Rights. This is an emphasis on patient autonomy. So each facility where you work should have a patient Bill of Rights. And right here, I've listed a few of those things like respectful care, a right to refuse, a right to privacy, and a right to know about charges and payments. This is not a comprehensive list. So it does, and in the list that's provided to your patients when they're admitted to your facility, it should have a comprehensive list. And it is going to vary from organization to organization, but these are some of the things that you might see. But remember that we have to allow patients to make choices about their care, and those choices should be informed. And if a patient is refusing care, then don't take it personally. It's nothing against you. But take the time to figure out what's going on with them and why they're refusing care. It could be a misunderstanding on their part, or it could be a misunderstanding on your own. Consent is vital to being a good healthcare provider. This is where the client is aware of the possible risks and agrees to receive care. An informed consent, which is even more important, is helping the patient understand everything that's going to go on with that procedure, the risks that are associated with it, the benefits that are associated with it. And it is a legal document where the patient is agreeing to have their body touched by a specific individual or group of individuals if they're having like surgery and there's more than one participant. You will come across multiple types of consent depending on where you decide to work, you have to have consent for immunizations and blood transfusions, admission into a facility, participating in research, etc. So depending, again, where you are, where you're not, you're going to have multiple informed consents that you might be providing. An informed consent has to be non-coerced, which means that you aren't holding anything over the patient's head, or somebody else isn't holding anything over their head to agree to have this signed. They need to be mentally and emotionally competent. And then in cases, we have something called implied consent, and this is going to be in cases of an emergency. So let's say there's a car accident and someone is unconscious. That's called implied consent. We assume that if they could consent, that they would say yes. But in those emergency situations where there's life-threatening things going on, we do our best to help save lives. And unless it's documented elsewhere for that person, like if they have something like a do not resuscitate, unless we have a physical copy of that, we're going to do everything to assume that they would want us to do everything we could to save their lives. Now, minors cannot legally consent to treatment, and consent must be given by a legal guardian. There are some exceptions inside this, and again, this is going to vary slightly from state to state, but the exceptions would include an emancipated minor, which is done by a legal court document, or marriage, or pregnancy, or they're serving in the armed forces. So marriage, pregnancy, serving in the armed forces, or being legally emancipated by the court. Those are all cases of an emancipated minor. Then there's also if a minor is seeking treatment for in emergency situations, like we said with the implied consent, or if there's substance abuse, sexual health, which can include birth control, STI testing and treatment, and then pregnancy or psychiatric services where the minor themselves can consent. Again, make sure that you're aware of that and you're talking to your supervisors as much as possible to make sure that you're following the protocols of your facility and also of your state. False imprisonment is where a patient is held against their will in a facility or even in an ambulance. So this is where you have to have something called consciousness of confinement. The patient has to believe that they cannot leave. So this would be like if the nurse comes in and says, I'm going to tie you to the bed if you don't take your medications or something like that. That's false imprisonment, and we never threaten to do that to people. We never threaten patients ever. And then along with that, we have restraints. This is restraining somebody's ability to move. Now, you might see some restraints used in a facility such as in ICU. If you have somebody who's on a ventilator and they keep pulling out and extubating themselves, then we're going to look at restraining them and tying their arms down. But there are very, very strict requirements with this, such as how often you have to have a doctor's order, how often you have to untie them and do range of motion exercises, and for how long they have to be untied. Then what can happen, though, is that people can abuse this ability. And so we can look at having locks on doors, rails on a bed, belts to tie people to wheelchairs. Some clothing can also be considered restrictive. Medications, we can medically restrain people with calming medication like lorazepam or something like that. And those are all going to be things that are restraining our patients, and patients have a right to be able to move. And our job as a nurse is to do our best to keep them safe, but we cannot physically restrain them unless we have very specific doctor's orders. So quick review on part 1 of legal issues is that ethical issues are things where there's not necessarily a specific right or wrong, but you can be sanctioned by your state board of nursing if you violate some of those ethical issues. There's a lot of regulations regarding what we can and can't do in nursing care. The standard of care is going to help us know where that standard is set, and it's our job to make sure that our care reaches that standards. And the patients have many rights, and we need to make sure that we're respectful, in particularly of their bodily autonomy. Thanks for tuning in. Please help me grow my channel by clicking subscribe and follow below.